I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Vincent Hayward, who's here from University of Pierre et Marie Curie, and you just heard my terrible, non-existent French accent in trying to say that. So I'll give you a little bit of background on Vincent. So he grew up in Paris, so he's from France, and then he spent quite a bit of his professional life in North America. He came first to Purdue in the US, in Indiana, and did a postdoc and was an assistant professor there, and then he moved to McGill in 1982, and was there at McGill until 2008. So most of us here who know Vincent know him from that period, or first met him during that period. I actually met Vincent when he was at McGill, but I was working in industry in California, and I went to a conference, and I didn't know anything about Canada or haptics in Canada, but I met this French guy who was there from Canada at a conference, and that was starting to introduce me to how much cool haptics work, which is my field, was going on in Canada at the time, and it was one of my first exposures to Canada, actually. And then I felt like I had a friend here when I came here a few years later myself. At McGill, he was the director of the Center for Intelligent Machines, SIM lab, which is still going on and is a really important part of the ECE department there. And some of us collaborate with other colleagues of Vincent who are still there at SIM now. And another story that I have is that when I first came here, there was a program called the IRIS program, which is a funding agency, a funding program that was available for several years, the NCE, and Vincent very kindly included me on one of his proposals to that and helped me get funding even though he's in a different part of the country. And so he's played that kind of helpful role to a lot of people over his career, kind of bringing junior people up to give them good starts. So in 2008, he was recruited back home to Paris to his current position as a professor at his current university, and as a high-profile position, an international chair in haptics. And so I want to make a point right now that even though some of you think of me as an HCI person, human-computer interaction, this is not an HCI talk. And this is very important because I love to collaborate with Vincent, and what makes it great is that I'm the HCI person and he's the person who builds really cool stuff that I get to play with. And so it's, he's going to talk about that side of things, I think, a little bit more. And so when I say what Vincent is interested, it's hard because I think he's interested in everything. And so it's hard to say, it's hard to find something he's not interested in. And he's particularly known in his research to haptic device design and applications perception and robotics, and particularly how those things work together. And devices, for example, intended to exploit specific knowledge of haptic psychophysics and multisensory illusions, which I believe is something that he's going to talk a lot about today. And it's very unusual to combine the knowledge of the haptic sensory neurological systems with the engineering capability to build these specialized devices that can actually meet those special human capabilities and then be exploited in different ways. And in fact, another little personal story is that when we came to know of a very talented individual who's a deaf-blind person who got to know in context of a conference that we held here a couple of years ago. And this person, so if you're deaf-blind, how you communicate is through signing, touching someone's hand. That's the only communication channel you have. This person was very interested in making some kind of a device so that he wouldn't have a human translator always communicating. This is his man. So Vincent is the kind of person you go to for that kind of challenge, and indeed I want to catch up and hear how that project is going. So, and of course Vincent has lots of honors and special things he's done, including some spin-offs he did while in Canada, which are an interesting model of how we could do spin-offs, and maybe he'll say a little bit about that at the end. And lots of awards. I hate having demos that we are hopeful of getting an award in the same conference that Vincent has demos because he always wins. So I just want to leave it with that, and we'll listen to what he has to say about touch illusions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Karen. That was a very touching introduction, and I'll try to entertain you at the same level for the next hour. So I put a picture on the screen here which illustrates the focus of our attention. There's a fingertip, which is imaged here on, I used a desktop scanner to look at the way it's made. And you can see there's a lot of interesting details in the fingertip. It's the location of the highest sensitivity in our body for feeling things. And it's a fascinating organ. Since I know in the audience quite a few people seem to have interested in vision, I will use a lot of analogies of the visual system to try to convey some of the wonderful properties of the tactile system. And other elements on the screen, ever since I moved back from Europe, I have the chance to get involved in a number of research programs, and maybe I'll say a word about them for a minute. This one is interesting. It's about making devices that you can wear and will give you tactile sensation. And so in this context, as we'll see, as you can see around you, your body has essentially specific areas for manipulation, which are the hands and the feet, which are essentially the inside part of the hands and the bottom part of the feet, which are specifically designed for manipulation and sensing. But the rest of the body is also a sensor. And the rest of the body is covered by another kind of skin. It's called the hairy skin, the one that has no hairs. And it has a role which has ignored for a long time. It seems to be heavily involved in being of the awareness of your body in space. Like when I move my arms around, I actually feel where they are through the skin which covers my body. So that's our role in the project, is actually to use that part to, if you want, stimulate the somatosensory system. So it's a little different from what was done before. Another project was with colleagues. We worked on the way people use their hand to grasp, which is a classic topic. But we had a particular role to play in that project to explain how the sensory capabilities of the hand are there for improving grasping strategies. I have the next program. That's something very special in Europe. It's a program that I had the chance to do pure theory, so there is no applications whatsoever attached to it. And so for the past 3 years, I've been working on completely blue sky ideas about haptics, with no real, if you want, immediate goal about it. So I'll speak a little bit of the first result we had in this context. And the idea is actually very much inspired by my colleagues in computer vision, who have, if you want, had started before the haptics people, if you want, the idea that vision is a computational process. It's something that happens in your head. And somehow, this is essentially what I propose to do, is to try to explain what is the computational background for feeling things. And so that was not mentioned before, that it was possible actually to talk about it. But now that we, 3 years inside the program, we have some ideas about actually what it takes to compute in order to feel things. And the latest program is actually very applied. Its proto-touch is actually to work on screens, actually tactile screens. But it's a very interesting program. It's university, industry-led, and it's not a research program. Actually, it's a fellowship program. But there are some companies interested in having better tactile screens involved. So that's what I'm busy doing these days. But that's worth explaining a little bit the background. entertain you for a minute with this picture. It's a prosthetic hand that was designed by Ambroise Paré, who was the doctor of François Ier in 1615, so at the beginning of the 16th century. And he was a very good doctor. He's the one who invented the concept of amputation and saved a lot of people for that. But also, because he was amputating people, he also came up with the idea to give them mechanical limbs. And that's one of his own design. It's very nice and very inspiring, because through mechanical means, he had found a way actually from a single trigger to get this hand to grasp, which is something which we know today was sometimes called through the concept of synergies, like, you know, essentially to capture the idea that if you do something complicated, there must be reduced subspaces which are sufficiently rich to span the complexity of a larger space. And that's the idea of synergies. It applies for motor control, but it also applies to sensory processing. So that's an interesting design. It's you can, if you come to Paris, you can see it in the museum and see all the gears and the way it works. But the fun part about it is that today we have also robotic hands, and they are still they have also lots of mechanics, but they still have very little sensing in them. Practically no sensing. The field of tactile sensing is way behind, so it's a sad reality. But in robotics, there is practically no tactile sensing to speak of, even though the idea, of course, has been suggested at least half a century ago that you should have sensitive skins for robots, like you have, electronic eyes or electronic ears. But today there is no such thing, or it comes in very simplified form. So that's an interesting observation. Maybe I'll explain why that is. Before we get into the why, maybe I'll ask you to guess what you are looking at here. So, yes, but what part of the gorilla?
The foot, it must be.
It is actually the foot, yeah, and actually you can see it here. Actually, yeah. So the gorilla has 4 hands actually. So it's so why is it fun and interesting? It's because this organ is due to the lifestyle of this animal, it's actually the same for the hand and the feet. But this organ is not completely randomly made. It has wonderful properties. And half of this wonder comes from the mechanics, and the other half comes from the sensing. and so it's really the interface to the world, the mechanical one. And so we'll try to discuss some of its properties. So I divided the talk into 3 sections. Often it is understood that the tactile sense or somatosensory system provides unambiguous information to the entity using it. The fact is that actually it's exactly the opposite. It is a very complicated, when I mean complicated, I really mean complicated sensing channel. It provides information which is fundamentally incomplete, and the result of this incompleteness is that actually if you work at it and study it, you realize that it's the ground for many different types of illusions of the same kind that exist for vision or audition. And these illusions arise for part from the fact that actually the tactile sense is ambiguous, and it works because actually the nervous system invests enormous computational resources to make it operate. And when I say enormous, it's really probably similar to vision, or perhaps more. And then I'll terminate with some work we have done in the biomechanics of the fingers, which actually are quite related to its wonderful sensing capabilities. So touch is the world of mechanics, the way vision is the world of optics, or audition is the world of acoustics. And so to have appreciated it, it is important to have some appreciation of what mechanics mean and what they are. So I'll start with touch is complicated, and the reason may be understood intuitively from sort of basic considerations. I will start from a classic notion in vision, which is the notion of the plane optic function. And what this function says is that if you have an organism or an animal which is looking around and sampling the optical world, then the optical world actually has a large but finite number of dimensions. And these dimensions can be counted rather easily. The act of seeing comes from counting photons that are incoming from the ambient light field. And essentially the number of photons coming into the eye, or the imager in general, depends on where you are, so that gives you 3 coordinates, which direction you are looking, so that gives you 2 extra coordinates, that makes 5. You can add a color, or so another coordinate, and then you add time, and then so you end up with 7. Of course, you could enrich it with another or 2 coordinates if you account for polarization of light. But you still have a small number of coordinates. So the question we ask, what is the same function when it comes to touch? How many numbers do you need to be able to talk about what you feel? So go back to the beginning. What does it make us feel? Essentially, is when our body comes into contact with another. And so we have I have to do something here. You should have told me. No, it'll come back again, so c'est possible. So yeah, 2 bodies coming in contact, and so the laws that are governing this contact are seems to be simple, but we can actually have a handle on them. The field that is at stake here is something called contact mechanics. But when you are looking at static worlds, and it's essentially waves if you have dynamics. So that's the physical context. But at the simplest level, what do you have? You have a probe, B, and then you have some unknown object, A, and the job of the probe is to find something about the object through contact. So if you want to represent or parameterize this situation, you essentially use the idea of continuum mechanics. And the idea of continuum mechanics is actually you consider a domain, A or B, and inside that domain you consider an infinite number of points. I mean really an infinite, so it's a continuum. And when you are working the physics of a domain, you essentially look at how the trajectory of these individual points. Okay, so you start essentially from an infinitum of trajectories. So you could think that the plane haptic functions basically can be written in a simple way. If you you have 2 bodies coming in contact, then essentially you have an infinite number of things that can be measured, all the points that are moving because of the contact. And then from that, then something happens, and then the job essentially is to learn something about A knowing B, which is very difficult to do because you are dealing with a continuum set of functions actually. So it's a bad start, and it's essentially useless argument because you cannot use it at such a level of generality. So something more interesting must be happening, which is there must be some way to simplify this formulation so it becomes practical, at least finite dimensional. And so, so we can think maybe what are the situations where that can be. And so there are some possible simplification. This one here is one which is commonly done without even thinking about it. The idea is essentially if you have our domains A and B that are coming in contact, there is always an initial point of contact before the deformation takes place. And then, so you have that, then you can actually simplify the interaction by using a small number of coordinates. Here, like rigid body displacements. So that's a possibility. And so you have, so that means basically you have a part of the probing body that you believe is not deforming, and then there's another part which is deforming. And all you care really is about what happens to the second body as a function of the rigid displacement. So now you have a small number of coordinates. Still quite a few actually, but it's now countable, and you can actually write computer programs to express that. So in mechanical terms, that means essentially you're making an assumption, which is that you have local deformation, which is what happens when I grab an object. I change the shape of my fingers when I grab an object, but I don't change the shape of my feet. So that's essentially the mechanical principle, which says that normally happens most of the time, not all the time. There are actually many counterexamples where you have actually mechanical objects which deform globally from a local contact. Well, actually, if you think this way, here is an opportunity for a pretty nice illusion, actually, if you come up with that counterexample. So that's something we do naturally, but of course, we think of it naturally because it happens most of the time, but of course, it's only an assumption. But there are other simplifications we can think of, like for example, here's a list. One which is done in all mechanical labs is that you assume the deformations are zero. So that's the first case. So basically you're saying that you have a rigid object which is touching a rigid environment, which is the case, for example, of a blind person with a cane and trying to find out what is the nature of the surrounding environment. So that's an example, but it's what you do when you use a caliper. Basically, you assume that the caliper doesn't change shape, and the object that you are touching doesn't change shape, and from that you can recover some of its properties, like its diameter, but it's always associated with a very large number of assumptions. But of course, you have other possibilities. You can have a rigid environment, like the table or the ground, and then you can have a soft probe, like my finger or my foot, which actually makes the planoptic function have a completely different form all of a sudden. It's got a completely different problem, and it has, it has a completely different form, and gives you some other possibilities. Or you can have the reverse, which is what happens when a surgeon does an operation. It has a rigid probe and a soft environment, and yet it's trying to do something, learn something about the environment of a rigid probe. It turns out it's very interesting because rigid probes, it can be shown theoretically that they give you the same information that if you had a soft one. But it does it. It's the same information, but it takes more time to acquire it. So in other words, the blind person that's trying to find out what's going on needs to have many contacts to have the same information that you would have if you had a soft contact. But theoretically, it's the same. And of course, because it's the mechanical world, and what makes haptics what it is, there are many complexities. One of them is owed to friction, which is a very important phenomenon and very fundamental to the sensing process. But there are many others, like this one I illustrated in a sort of a surgical context, we tend to think of functions as being one-to-one, but mechanical things are never one-to-one, and that's a really good example here. If I have a body here with, say, a hard inclusion, and I would like to find out where it is, then I go and probe it, like I would do in palpation. And in case A, I would take my probe and then push hard on it to feel it, and then push sideways, which would actually push the hard inclusion on the right. And I do now exactly the same experiment, but instead of pushing hard, I push softly first, so it will flip on the other side. And I end up exactly at the same place as the other trajectory, but I have a completely different situation. So that's an example where it shows that actually what you sense depends on what you do, which is not exactly similar to audition or vision. And on the other hand, because of these complexities, also gives you sensing options, which are completely unique to mechanics. And so lack of unicity is one, and the second is hysteresis. Like mechanical things tend to stay where they are, which is also not very special to mechanics. So that's what we learned from thinking of these problems in a sort of a general way. And of course, you can notice that in nature, all kinds of sensing organs have been invented in the natural world. I just give here 3 examples, but if you look a bit in zoology, there are many, many interesting cases of haptic probes. The one on the left is supposed to represent the primate finger, which essentially is a bone with a soft cover. And what is so key about this soft cover that it's filled with an incompressible fluid or a tissue. And that is a really important property about it. And then so we might talk a little bit about this particular strategy for making a probe. Another one is the rodents. I've been the study of many, many studies because it's a very interesting animal model. But the rodents use their whiskers to feel things, and they do it at speeds and dexterity which is phenomenal. And they use strategies which are actually a result of what I was talking about from the viewpoint that the whiskers are actually rigid objects. Well, they are, of course, elastic, but they are essentially point contact. And as far as I can tell, the rodents have 3 ways of using them. The first way is actually to whisk all the whiskers together in synchronicity. And there is a sensory motor loop that essentially stops the motion when they hit the contact. And essentially the sequence of contacts gives you the shape. So it's automatic, if you want, space-to-time transformation, or rather time-to-space transformation, which is very in tune with general function of the nervous system. There is a second strategy, which is actually to hit the obstacles. And then from the bending properties of the whisker, the animal can detect the point of contact along the shaft of the whisker and does it very well. So that's a second sensing strategy, which is one of the cases I was talking about. And the third is actually to drag the whiskers on the surfaces in order to, if you want, record or perceive their microgeometry, very much the texture, if you want. So it's it's a way of doing haptics, which is very interesting, very efficient. And the third example I came up with is a paramecium, which is a one-cellular organism. It's a small swimming animal, only 1 cell, and it's a super haptic animal actually. What it does in life, it swims forward in this direction. It has little swimmers, little cilia. And whenever it hits an obstacle, it deforms its nose, essentially, and then the cilia starts swimming the other way. So it swims backward. But because its body is not symmetrical, it has always this kink shape, it will swim in a circle backward. So it will never go back to where it started. And it has a delay mechanism in the membrane chemistry, which actually makes the posterior sensor, which is also haptic, react after a delay. So essentially it swings forward, hits something, goes backward for a few, and you can show very simply that it's a very excellent strategy. It will actually cover simple, if you want, plane haptic function will be sampled completely using that strategy. You can actually in the plane you can work it out really easily that it actually converges to complete coverage. So it's all this with one cell, which is a very nice way to think about it. But essentially, primate like us, we do the same thing, but much faster, with a lot more contact than sequential. So that's examples of reasoning we can do. So now I'd like to show you examples of how touch, which is sometimes believed as something which gives you the truth, as actually being something which is fundamentally ambiguous, like most sensing processes. Very simple example. Fingers can be used to read Braille, and so Braille is nothing but an arrangement of little dots which are raised out of the surface, and then you scan your fingers on these dots, and then you experience characters which are made by assembling them 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 6 dots. Okay, so it's been known for almost 2 centuries. I mean, Braille has been designed and taught and used, and it has a spacing of 2.5 millimeter, and it's an international standard, and it has to be 2.5 millimeter spacing in between the dots. And for a long time it was said, oh, you need 2.5 millimeter because when you touch an object, this is kind of the threshold, to detect. But well, you might actually not be so convinced by such an explanation, because Braille readers essentially have moving hands. So it's a constant choreography of the fingers on the Braille. And so there's not really a notion of a threshold. And so we thought that something else is happening. It is very analogous actually to the eye scanning scene. It has to essentially, the eye has to be able to target a particular place in space and then saccade to another and then come back and so forth. And essentially the saccade pursuit cycle. So it might be something similar in touch. You only have a very small sample of space, and when you are reading something complicated, then you need to go and come back and go and come back and so on. And so we thought, well, this is very much ambiguous. To that to work, it would mean that actually the reader would be capable of positioning a finger exactly in space, and go back to read some other character and come back, and and basically being able to servo the finger exactly at the same place, to an accuracy of a few sub-millimeter, which is completely outside the way we're actually built. Our proprioception is actually much, much coarser than that. And so there must be another process going on here. And so it probably has something to do with the brain strategy for actually scanning seeds and finding places as anchor points. And so there's a phenomenon actually we reproduce from vision, which is a so-called suppression of displacement. So the idea is that if you look at a portion of space, move your eyes to another, and then go back to the same portion of the space, then you're perfectly allowed to shift it by a significant amount, and it will look stationary. Okay. So the same thing happens in touch actually. You can actually present information to the finger, let the finger go and do their job, and when they come back, they actually, the mind will take it as being the same place, and the measurement we made essentially is that the leeway you have is to about between 2 and 3 millimeters. So you're perfectly allowed to to shift the world by 2 or 3 millimeters, as long as if you want the information to be the same, then it's the same place in space. Okay, so that's a good example of ambiguity, which is resolved by a higher process than sheer, accuracy in the sensing. So that's an example. A second example is one of my favorite. It actually was the topic of a master's thesis quite a while ago of Vincent Hayward, who has done all kind of other projects in the meantime, including spending some time in Karen's lab and do very interesting work. But we can go back to the original masters. And the idea, at this time, we wanted to make a TV for the fingers. And so to make a TV for the fingers, you need a camera and you need a screen. And so that's the camera part. What is it that you feel? As we seen before, basically it's how your fingers deform. That's the seat of the sensation. So we essentially imaged what happens when you scan your fingers on glass surfaces, which is what gives us the option of imaging. And because we don't have much time, I'll just show the rightmost example. And I'll ask you to watch carefully what you see. Oops. So that's exactly what happens when a finger touches a piece of glass which is flat, like or a low curvature, like a glass of beer, and then when it slides on it, well, what you feel is a glass of beer, okay, and glass. But the mechanical reality is that your finger moves in a very complicated manner. And I'll play it again, so you can really see what's going on. So what really is going on is that the finger is soft, of course, and the object which is touched is hard in that case. And then what is happening is that actually the skin starts sliding by the periphery. And it takes, we made later a more accurate measurement, but it takes a good, from 300 to half a second between the finger starts slipping and the time it slips completely. So there's a lot of going on, so we are, if you want, accustomed to the idea that friction is something that happens immediately, or slip. In high school you learn about the Coulomb law. So it tells you, okay, if the loading on the side is small enough, nothing happens. And if it's big enough, then you have an if, then else, and it slips. But the reality of the physics is actually it's a continuous process from the adhesion. It's not really adhesion, actually, from the state of non-slipping to the full state of slip. And that, in the case of soft finger, is a very long process. And it has also a very specific geometry, as we have seen, which is the result, actually, of the complicated boundary-free problem, in reality, where the tissues are loaded and then they start slipping, and then the boundary of between non-slip and slip varies through time. So it's interesting. It shows two very important points. Is that what you feel consciously is very different from really what happens mechanically. And so you can compare that to this notion that no one is aware of what is going on one's retina. You only see things outside your body. And if you could see what's going on your retina, you'd be really surprised. So something is clearly the analogous in touch. If you really, measured everything that was going on in your finger, that's, you'd be completely incapacitated. So you can view that as actually a very nice case of an inverse problem. And then we'll see in a few minutes that actually there are many mechanical conditions that will give you similar mechanical state in the finger, which actually makes the act of feeling very much ambiguous. So here what you feel is flatness and glass. Very interesting, because actually it's two, what we say in perception, like you have two distinct percepts. One is geometry, and the other one is a material. And it all comes from these complicated movements. So that's part of the reason why that is, actually. I have no, I'll skip this one. It'll take too long. We then later managed to, if you want, realize what could be compared to TVs for the fingertip. And the way actually this system works is actually trying to reproduce what you've seen on the movie here, which is essentially massaging the skin at a very small space scale and creating patterns of deformation that we have seen actually in the movie. And I'll give you a few one example of it actually, which is this one. It's one way to program this machine, which actually will stretch and pull the skin locally into a pattern which actually resembles, in that case, a traveling wave. Okay, so a traveling wave essentially it's a wave that moves through a space, and the way, and if you sample it at fixed point in space, what you see are oscillations locally. And what makes it a traveling wave is that these oscillations are phased. So each point in space oscillates like the next, but with a phase difference. And so it so happens that if you put your finger on this stimulus, you really feel a wave, actually. But it's very interesting because not only you feel a wave, but you can say three things about it. You can say at which speed it moves. You are very good at telling what is its spatial frequency, and also you can also tell what is its height. So these points may indicate that actually our nervous system is tuned to inverse that complicated mechanical problem into a simple percept. And it can be reduced here into three numbers. Three quantities that you can discriminate and detect. And so here's an example actually of the use of that machine. We had the non-sighted subject, and their job was actually to tell the shape of things they would touch. So that's a functional question. Is it a triangle, a circle, or a square? So I'll show you the example of a square here. So the person is not aware of the shape, and the red pattern here represents the small actuators I was showing, and as they will move around, then essentially the dots here will represent, if you want, a border, and they will start moving accordingly, and skipping the details, essentially provide a sensation of a continuous edge. Okay, and then you'll see what the person is doing. Actually, when trying to tell what it felt. So there is a first exploratory movement, and then there is a very nice tracking, escaping the object, coming back, and then from that on, the answer was already given. The person already felt it was a square. Okay. And why is it? It's because essentially it was known ahead of time it was either a circle, a square, or a triangle. And it took, essentially to detect an edge and a corner, and that's all it took, actually. And you can actually see that in the behavior. There was a first tracking, and only a verification for the other side, and the answer was given, which is very much a perceptual behavior, which is essentially guessing and verifying what the guess is correct or not. So that's nice because it shows the display works well. And I'll give you another example of ambiguity, which is actually something much fun to do. Of course, it's clear that we've seen in the beginning that what you feel is a very small amount of all the mechanical stimulation that we receive. So here's an example, which is very simple to reproduce. It's fun to do. You take a stick like this one and you put a sensor in the handle so the stick can tell its orientation to gravity. Okay, it's an accelerometer. And then you have this very simple computer algorithm that takes that angle and turns it into a vibration in such a way that that vibration reproduces, if you want, the signature of a ball that rolls down an inclined plane. So we all remember from Galileo that all objects which are round move down inclined plane at the same rate, regardless of their material and regardless of their size. And so that's what we put in the computer. In fact, the computer algorithm has only one parameter, which is the rate of change of, in that case, a spectrum through time for a fixed angle, which is illustrated here. If I would put the stick at a fixed angle, then it would have a fundamental that goes up in frequency, and then the harmonics would do the same. And that's what you would feel, okay, that signal. And I can tell you that when you actually hold that stick, you have this immediate and strong sensation that actually there is an object moving inside the stick. And it's so good that actually if you ask people to tell where the object is, they can, point and tell. So it's very, to me, it's very interesting because what comes in the system is a temporal signal, and then what comes out is a place in space. And what is in between is an algorithm. The virtual reality algorithm is quite simple to make here. But the reverse algorithm is certainly present inside the nervous system somewhere because it's absolutely spontaneous. And we have a new, I'm showing this example because it's so powerful that we have preliminary evidence that actually you also hear the ball moving inside the stick. So essentially it creates what's called a ventriloquist effect. So actually the sound source is also moving, simply from a trivial vibration in the hand. So that gives you some indication of the different interconnections between the different pathways that may exist between haptics and other sensory mechanisms. So that's an example for acoustics. I'll skip this one because we have no time, but I would like to give you, that's an example for vision of integration of pathways, which are used actually to disambiguate the mechanical world. To explain it, I'll briefly show this one. No. What am I doing? I'm lost. Here, yes. So that's a fun and interesting study. What it says is that it was for a long time believed that when you feel this shape of objects because of the position of your fingers. So in other words, I feel this flatness here because my fingers are in a plane. Okay, so we can actually demonstratively show it's not the case. You actually feel shapes in a very different way through a variety of mechanical cues. And here is one, is actually the resistance to motion. And resistance to motion is very much associated to shape. And basically what it says is that you're pushing against a force field, and your brain is aware that actually this force field varies concomitantly with the motions of your limbs. Then the only possible interpretation for that particular association is actually to change It's actually to modify, to come out of the plane, actually. And it is so strong that actually you can create what's called a paradoxical situation, where your limbs are actually moving in one direction, but your perception is the opposite, which is very strange, very paradoxical. So essentially you can make a situation where you push on the surface, it's actually moving towards you, but your fingers moving in the other direction. So what does it tell you? Essentially it tells you that actually your brain is being organized to resolve ambiguities from all sources of information, and one of the most important is actually what you do, essentially the motor command. So the second example, and which brings me to this case I wanted to show you, is actually this notion that the body moves with respect to the world. If you want, is often attributed to the fact that we have a sense of movement from, but it turns out that actually any source of information of movement is good enough. And so here we have these experiments going on, where this effect of shape is created, but the hands are not moving, and instead the eyes are moving. So essentially the idea is that the mechanical stimulation on the finger is associated to your eye movements. And when the correlation is correct, then you actually feel your hand moving, although it's not moving. So, well, we can now start to think how the whole system works. And clearly, detection of external movement or self-movement is one of these most fundamental sources of information. So there are, if you come to my lab, I'll be happy to show you all kinds of other examples, which I don't have time to show you today, but come from the same barrel, if you want, okay? Of essentially isolating the sources of information, whether they are acoustic, mechanical, or visual, and then recombining them in strange ways to see what are the percepts coming in. And finally, it comes to a fairly, probably a simpler picture that would have been the case a few years ago. How much more time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So that's good. I'll conclude, or I'll start concluding. I was hoping to give you more stuff, but I'll conclude on this one. Yeah, I thought this one is good because this is more in line with what our current concern of the real mechanics, I mean the biomechanics, and in particular tribology, which is the study of how bodies fail to move, okay, which is what tribology is about. And so it turns out that the tribology of human fingers is very much dependent on water. Okay, the fact that we're living organisms, we're made of water, and then our bodies permanently exude water because we are alive, makes our essentially we're always humid. If we're not, we're dead, basically. And so the water, what it does, it really has a profound effect on the mechanical properties of the skin. In particular, what it does, it makes the skin have properties that are very close to being a plastic material as opposed to an elastic material. And plastic materials have very different behaviors when it comes to contact. The most common example we know of is Play-Doh. So it's plastic, and when you put Play-Doh on glass, it just sticks. Okay, and that's basically what our fingers do because they are wet. Okay, so in a sort of a simple and simplified version. So think of the human fingers actually are made of Play-Doh, but wet Play-Doh essentially. And that's why they stick so well, and they are so good at grabbing stuff. And here is a consequence of that basic property. It was believed, it's still believed, that actually when you grasp object, you control the, if you want, the absence of slip through pressuring your fingers more or less. Okay, in fact, you can show that's the case. But it also happens that this stability of the object depends very much on the water, which is coming from the fingers. So here's the idea. The first, at the top of the panel here is an illustration of what I was showing in the beginning. If you load a contact, it has a nice contact like this one, and then you load the tissues, they start deforming, and then they start slipping from the periphery, and then you have an inward shrinking boundary of stuck surface, which eventually vanishes to become the full slip. Okay, so that takes a long time, and you can actually quantify this phenomenon through a diagram like this one. You have the loading force here, and I'll say in passing that actually the squeezing force, like the normal force, is essentially second order. You can basically ignore it. Okay, at least for a finger against glass. And then we have two subjects. One of them has dry skin and the second has wet skin, which is something which can be induced pharmacologically or happens spontaneously. And so a long time it was believed that actually when you have problem with grasping, like for example when you're getting old, which is something that happens, you let object escape your fingers, it's a motor problem. Okay, well, it seems to be that a good part of the problem is actually because your skin becomes dry. And so here is the reasoning. If you have a dry skin, here what happens, the relationship between the load and the quality of the grip, essentially the stick ratio, which is how much skin is in adhesion, it goes from 0 to 1. If you have a dry skin, the slope is very sharp. Okay. If you have wet skin, the slope is much shallower. Okay. So what does it mean in terms of control? It means essentially that you have essentially a grasp is an unstable system, and the job of the nervous system is to make it stable against perturbations. Okay. So the perturbation essentially would be the unknown weight of the object or some other possibilities. So if you have a dry skin, essentially your distance to failure is very short in magnitude, but also in time. That's the most important thing. Actually, the smallest increment of loading on a dry finger will make it fail in a very near future. If you have wet finger, then you have a lot longer time to react. And so the lesson is that actually, if you want to keep your you have to keep your finger moist, because that's what gives you, if you want, the largest stability margin. Not because of the coefficient of friction, it has nothing to do with it. It is simply because it puts the system in a more stable situation from a basic control viewpoint. So put humidifiers at home, and that's the best thing you can do. So we have lots of other results in that direction, but I'll stop here on textures and so on. And I'll conclude on this slide here. A lot of these illusions can be made with simple means. This is a somewhat old survey, but it's still up to date. It contains a list of 23 of these tactile illusions that you can, and half of them are easily realized by simple hardware or experiments you can do at home, like After Effects, for example. After Effects are a very rich source of illusions, and in Touch there are many of them, and so on. And so these are mechanical examples that are easy to make, and But since then, I can say that we have added to the list of 23 illusions at least 10 since that was written. So it becomes a very long and complete, rich topic, because every single of these illusions is actually a window on actually what the brain is doing or not doing, actually, and often for very good reasons. So since I've run out of time, I'll stop here. To leave time for questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any illusions that we experience day to day that are, that say you're always fooled by them?
Well, since you, I guess your question, yeah, I suspect everything you feel is, in a sense, an illusion, because it's like everything you see, is never very little. If you think of this planaptic crazy idea, if you really look at it completely, you have this infinite number of dimensions, and then the number of, in order to actually measure the mechanical state of your body, takes R9 dimensions, because you have a tensor of deformation on the volume, and that's only the linear part. So it's really enormous, and so what you actually feel is a tiny little portion of what happens. And the entire body is a sensor, mechanical sensor. There is innovation all over the place. I'll give you an anecdote. My colleague Tonard at the University of Louvain in Brussels had patients, and these patients had severed hands, in an accident, or they cut the nerve here and they couldn't feel anything. And of course, it can be repaired, surgically if you're lucky. And so these patients have hands, but the hands are essentially completely insensitive. You can take a knife and go like this, you feel nothing at all. And then he asks, so the question is like in every field, how do you rate, how do you rate progress? Okay, so you can ask the patient to do a task, or to perceptual or motor task, actually they come together. And in that case, the task was to rank sandpaper, from very fine to very coarse. And then to the surprise of the lead doctor who was involved in this, is that this patient who had hands that are completely diaphoreted, essentially, could do the paper ranking like you and me, like 1 week after the operation. And so that's kind of mysterious, because every textbook tells you that actually the skin does the texture, okay? But clearly it's not only the skin. And so we went ahead, actually I have some slides on this, but we went and measured the mechanical activity higher up in the anatomy, and then in fact it's very much measurable, that whenever you touch an object, even so slightly, there is mechanical propagation in the tissues, probably through the tendons that go very far, and actually encounter a very large population of receptors, which can be actually stimulated by, at very long distances. So when you think of that, it's rather frightening, because it means that every time you do anything, actually you have this enormous quantity of information coming from all over the place, and so the computational task is actually to sort out what is its origin and what it means, but it's very different from vision at this point. You cannot say that there is easily identifiable locus of stimulation. So if I had more time, then we could start questioning the notion of receptive field, for example. What does it mean in the mechanical domain. It certainly is a good notion, but it is a very different nature. Yeah. And then Dinesh.
I'm here.
No, you first.
One of the things that's always fascinated me is tool use.
Yes.
A very simple example, I
Yeah.
can grab my pen, I can rub it on the paper, I can rub it on the plate, I can rub it on the desk, and get a very good idea of the difference in their surface roughness. And also the perception that I'm actually touching with the tip of the pen.
Yeah.
The only thing that's happening is, vibrations.
Absolutely, like the, yeah.
So the question is, do you have anything to shed light on tool use? And in particular, there are relatively few animals that make use of tools.
Yeah.
The general presumption is that we're the only ones that are smart enough
No.
to use tools. I think
Birds
this
do
has
it.
something to do with the haptics.
No, birds do it with a beak.
Yeah, some
yeah.
of that happens, I'm sure, certainly. But your thoughts on tools?
Well, I don't have any profound thoughts on it yet. We
Yeah, 5 minutes.
It is certainly an everyday observation that touch has this unique property, actually, like the psychologists say, of being proximal or distal. So vision is always distal, you never see your retina, but touch you can do both. You can, you can actually feel the tip of the pen, or you can actually feel the contact with the pen, and you can switch from one another, from attention. And so it's a very profound question. When is it that actually your mind switches from distal to proximal perception? And so we have some ideas now on what makes it possible. I mean, what makes it happen? And I hope these findings, because it's a beginning research now, I hope this finding will be important later for designing better cockpits and haptic interfaces and so on. What is it that make actually the proximal stimulation become distal? The whole story has to do with invariance. If you want relationships, or a sensory motor relationship which has, if you want, invariant properties. I have some ideas of what these are now, but I didn't do any formal experiments. But maybe I'll give you one idea. The spectrum I was showing earlier, you saw that actually it was evolving through time. So it was a chirp, actually, a chirp type signal. There is a good reason to think that these chirp type signals in haptics are the most fundamental elements. There is, when you move your hands and interact with the world, there is no notion of, if you want, a stationary spectrum. It's always shifting. And so if you want the non-stationary part of the spectrum can be viewed as really a problem, because it's hard to analyze, it's hard to think about it, but actually is where the information is. And so in that sense, it's quite different from acoustics. Although in acoustics, it's also the case that non-stationary part of spectra are the carrier of information. But in haptics, it's interesting because the non-stationary part is your own body. It's actually the movement of your body to the world. So that would be actually where I would be looking for invariance. We have one example of it, which is actually which is a part of the illusion. You know vection, the phenomenon of vection, when you're in a train and then you're looking forward and then the train nearby starts moving and then you feel that you actually have self-motion, okay? So we have a case where we actually can raise or actually lower the threshold of the onset of vection, optical vection, by providing, if you want, a non-stationary vibration in the feet or in the body, which is actually correlated to the optical velocity. And so that's the example. Essentially, if you have this the correct invariance, then boop, you have the effect. So that's what I would answer to your question.
Thank you. Well, that's why you disclaimer.
So, just a quick question. So, I'm still struck by the lack of tangential force sensing and tactile sensors in robotics. Could you run your stress sensor backwards?
Oh yes, you could. Yeah.
I might have done that with Karen.
Yeah. What? So I'll rephrase the question. Make sure I understand it. When two bodies interact, you have essentially there's only there's only one force of interaction at a given point, but in reality it's a distribution, and the distribution of forces has two components: one which is normal and the other one tangential. And so what you are referring to is that most, if you want, robotics thinking is focused on the normal component. But of course, the tangential component is... so how do you measure it? Yeah.
Show that the tangential is really the critical part.
Yes, we could actually make an array of pressure sensors in a general sense, because it really is a pressure, and so the pressure component has these two. It's not so simple actually, because the notion of being normal and tangential is a reference to the surface, and many surfaces don't have normals, which is very annoying actually. And so I believe actually it's a rather misleading way of thinking, and I would be ready to talk about it more offline maybe, because it's not so easy to sweep under the carpet. Yeah. See what I mean? Yeah.
One of the things we always talk about in the haptics world that is useful for illusions is that you could actually construct devices that are useful for a virtual reality display or interfaces or something where it's notoriously difficult to render things haptically because you have to build moving parts and all that. And the hardware is big and bulky, but with illusions, perhaps you can cut corners and make things work. We have lots of examples of that. Like, do you have any favorites or things that you're looking forward to seeing?
Yes, well, I didn't have time, but I did have a few slides on this. And if you allow me, I'll flip back. Okay. Here. Yes, this study here. Many, if you want attributes of the object you feel have texture, so they are not flat, they are nice or not nice, microstructure about them, which is due to the geometry, but also very much about the tribology. You could have actually two surfaces having the same microgeometry but feel completely differently, which is actually a very interesting idea. So here is the idea. If you wanted to make a display for these fine textures, how would you go about it? So the naive way is actually to take many little micropins and make them move up and down and try to copy the microgeometry of whatever you want to render, which is irrealizable. Okay. There's another idea which says that actually your sensing organ has finite, if you want, channel capacity. There is so much that can be measured and transmitted, which actually can be measured formally, but I will not do it now. So here's the idea. If you reduce that channel to only one dimension, which is like a vibration, can you do a texture display? And the answer is actually you can. And it's actually a very nice one and very expressive. And that's how it goes. Here we have a sensor, which is very stiff. So it's like a rock. Okay? And then you have a finger, which is sliding on this surface. and the sensor picks up the frictional component. Okay? But it does it in a way which is compatible with what we expect from the tactile channel, which is like up to many hundreds of hertz. Okay? And so the hypothesis was, now if I take that signal, which I created by sliding my finger on a surface, and if I now replay, if you want, that signal with, in that case, the same device, but run backward. Now what I'm doing is like essentially I had measured displacement, forces in that case. And in the second case, I have actually displacements. Okay? And so, so we did a number of studies to show that actually if you did a one-to-one, if you want, copy, in other words, if you would replay whatever displacement was measured as a force at the same place, so that involves some signal processing. It had actually to involve resampling the signal from time to space. But skipping over all the technical details, the net result is that if you do that, you actually can, if you want, represent those surfaces in a domain, in a spatial domain, completely. Okay, so you have here spatial frequencies and then spatial positions here. And you take different type of surfaces, and you can see that they actually have a spectrum, and that spectrum varies in space and reproduces more or less the interaction of the finger and the surface there. And you can see, for example, if you have these edges here, they correspond to bursts of energy, but you always have high frequency components which are coming we don't know where, because the whole system is phenomenally nonlinear. That's the beauty about friction. There's nothing linear about it. So it can take an input, and then the output can be very different from the input because of this nonlinearity. And so in essence, what we did is record these spatial spectra and then replay them. Okay. If you want the phenomenal experience that you have is really excellent. You really feel, an edge here, this kind of texture there, and so on. And it's very strange and complicated, and maybe not so in the end. See, these are two surfaces that are really different visually, but tactilely speaking, they are basically the same, actually. And this is because actually the spatial frequency of these little dots here is pretty small compared to the size of the sensor. And so that's what is meant. And actually, for the industry, this is really good. I mean, you can make simulated object, and it's really not the shape that matters. It's really this, transformation from microgeometry into this, vibrations, which is important. And so that's the performance that you get actually in asking people to actually sort out, to associate surfaces. That's the first panel here is real. That's right, and that's the simulated. And then so you have a little more confusion here between these two cases. But so now what it means essentially with a vibrating plate you can do pretty nice textures actually. But when you feel them, they feel like textures, but they are really not realistic. In the sense that when you run your fingers on a surface, as we've seen, you have first adhesion and then you have transition to slip. And this is completely missing here. Okay. And that transition, as we have seen, is incredibly rich of information as well. So if you remove that, It's a bit like watching a cartoon. You have a certain aspect of, but you're missing some others. So yeah.
I think we'll stop there. It's 5 o'clock, and I'd like to let people get going. Let's give. And you have more questions, please come down.
And the slides can be given also. Yeah.
So it's good to